follow-up meeting from what we had. We started this particular group back in September 26, 2022. We had an agenda there, and then we had another meeting on January 10th, 2023, and subsequently this particular meeting. There is an agenda which I have back there on the table. It's a very limited, short agenda, but it has a lot in it. Several areas which we want to look at today. Well, let me first get, is there a need for us to introduce ourselves to the public? Does everybody know Representative Cornell, Representative Lunos on it, Representative Myler is not on this particular committee, but he asked if he could attend, and I agreed. Representative Cordelli, myself, Rick Ladd, and Senator Ruth Ward, who chairs Senate Ed. And yes, and Oliver Ford is also on this. He is on the House Education Committee. He is absent today, unable to attend. So I'd like to first ask anybody on the committee if there's anything else they'd like to add underneath other. This is the Legislative Oversight Committee for Improvement and Assessment of Education. Is there any other item which folks see that they would like to add to this agenda for today? Not hearing anything? Okay, so what we have on the agenda, there's actually several topics which I'd like to go through. Item number 2 is attached to this agenda, and it lists the statutory responsibilities and all the areas which we make reference to academic standards and the minimum standards for public school approval. All the references that are contained within statutory language. We may want to be referencing that as we go through today's discussion. I want to also look at several areas today that are on number 4 and later number 5. We've now received the report from that's been proposed, the initial proposal, ED 306, minimum standards for public school approval. And those standards have now been presented to the state board. That particular entity has not taken any action. However, as a committee here in the House and Senate that's responsible for legislative oversight, we want to take a look at that today. Secondly, quickly, the mathematics. That was an area that was addressed on our previous agenda back on January 10th. New Hampshire State Task Force on Mathematics Instruction. I went through that, and that was a report that was presented back in 2012. Deputy Commissioner Paul Leather at that time headed it, and there were a number of recommendations came forward which we discussed at that time. One, to follow up on that, we know that this is an area that we saw a slide in our achievement scores in the statewide, as a result of the pandemic, but not necessarily just pandemic, but what's been going on in the last 10 or so years. And so when we get to that, I'd like to be just asking, are there any strategies that are being going on in the local schools to try and raise those achievement scores? They have responsibility for curriculum. We have responsibility of the state, or the state board has responsibility for the academic standards. But what is being done out in the field, this body would like to get some information we can. And we're not going to be able to get that today, but maybe we can find out what kind of strategies are going on, what's being done in the SAUs, the districts, etc., cooperatives, to try to address this issue. So I'd like to take a leap back so we can maximize our time and open this up to number 4, the initial review of the initial proposal, ED 306. Everybody here should have a copy of those, of the draft which was submitted to the state board. I also have copies of the old the 2014/15 version of the rules here, if we need them as a reference later on. So how would everybody at the committee like to do this? Just walk through it, sort of like page by page, start working away at it and understanding. And Nate, you're here also from the department where we may have questions. Would you be able to try to address some of those as we wade through it?
Yes, absolutely. You want me to come up?
Yes, why don't you come up to the table? Yes.
Yeah, I think before we start going through this, would it be possible for Dr. Greenberg to kind of give us a status report of, now that it's public, what's the next steps as far as the review, when it's going to go back before the state board, et cetera, just to give us an overview of its status right now. Thank you.
I think that'd be very helpful, so that if we have to have follow-up on something we're doing here, we can do it in a timely manner prior to state board taking action.
Absolutely. So for the record, my name is Dr. Green with the New Hampshire Department of Education. I have been serving for the last couple of years as the department liaison to the team that has been working on the revisions and the recommendations for the minimum standards. That has been an external team to the department made up of some principals, superintendents, curriculum administrators, and overseen by Fred Bramante with the National Center for Competency-Based Learning. The current status right now, the state board took it up as an initial proposal at the last state board meeting this past month. And the version that they have is the track changes version that's submitted the way all rules are submitted. So you see things as struck out, you see things as bold and italicized, and it's a pretty lengthy and extensive document. So one of the things the state board requested was some additional time to go through that document, and they tabled it to the next meeting. So right now they have not actually taken it up as an initial proposal. It's currently tabled just to give the state board that additional time to look through it. My guess or my assumption is that they're going to take that up then as an initial proposal at the next state board meeting in April.
Do you know when in April that's scheduled?
It's always the second Thursday of the month. I believe that's April 13th, this coming month.
Follow-up, please.
Yes.
So thank you. I know in my conversations with Mr. Bramante, he had indicated to me that there's 27 school districts, at least at the time I talked with him, that wanted to have a public hearing or a public review of this. So are you saying that between the March date that the board received the report and tabled it, that those 27 hearings will in fact have taken place prior to the next board meeting?
No, so those have not started yet. That's something that Mr. Bramante wants to do in an effort to generate additional public feedback on the standards. So once the state board takes it up as an initial proposal, likely at the April meeting, then he'll schedule out those listening sessions. We plan to have an email address and a site set up at the department site that Mr. Bramante can give out to the public when he's doing those listening sessions, so people can submit direct public feedback to that email inbox. When you start the rulemaking process, there are some legislatively mandated timelines for that. So there's really only about a 60-day window or so from the time the state board takes up that proposal to when we sort of have to close off the public feedback. So I know he's hoping to schedule those 27 sessions within that 60-day window, starting on April 13th.
So just about, so the tabling motion from the state board does not start the clock then?
That's
correct. The
correct.
clock starts in April when they actually say, okay, now we have it.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons
Thank
they
you.
tabled it. They didn't want to start the clock until they were really ready to go with it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so what we'd like to do, are there any further questions of Dr. Green? So the meeting, which is on 13th, is the board's accepting these and then putting out, so they're not approving at the same meeting?
No. So this would just be an initial proposal, and that puts it on the table. That starts the clock, so to speak. And then the state board plans to schedule an additional day for a public hearing. Normally, public hearings take place during a regularly scheduled state board meeting, but we're anticipating a large amount of public feedback on this particular document. So the state board plans to hold a special meeting just to do public feedback on this document, most likely scheduled within a month or so of that April meeting. So my guess would be a date probably sometime in mid-May.
Okay, I've spoken with the chair of JELCAR, Joint Legislative Committee Administrative Rules, and they're desiring to have any input from this particular group and from the two education committees, Senate and House, regarding the rules. So we're really trying to coordinate and collaborate together on this. So with that, I'd like to just start delving into the rules, and let's just go page by page. And to start it out, I do have a question on page 1. When we're talking about competencies is everybody got this open, page 1?
Yep.
And where it says competencies. Competencies are statements of the knowledge and skills that define what a student will be able to do as a result of a specific set of learning opportunities. When I look at the 2014 edition, that's not what we had in it. And that says competencies means student learning targets that represent key content-specific concepts, skills, and knowledge applied within our cross-content domains. And it goes on to read. When I went and checked with what we have in statute right now, and the handout on the agenda, if you look at the, let's see, the section that deals with competencies here, on page 10, and page 10 as reads in statute right now is contrary to what is in these rules. Competencies mean student learning targets that represent a level of mastery of key content, and it goes on. So there is a difference right here on page 1 between the definition of competencies, and I think this is very, very important, seeing that when we're talking about these targeted areas of learning, which are in the minimum standards of public school approval, we're also now looking at an area which is the responsibility of this particular oversight group. So is there any, so that's a part that I offer as a need for some change, if we're still using the verbiage competencies. Representative Cornell.
Is your problem or concern that they leave out mastery of the skills in the new rules? Because all it says is statements of knowledge and skills, and the old one says learn to a level of mastery of concepts, skills, and knowledge. So the new one doesn't seem to be.
Okay,
asking
my
for a mastery.
concern would be, Representative Cornell, if you go to page 7 in the backup materials on the agenda, it talks about the Legislative Oversight Committee and responsibilities of the Legislative Oversight Committee. If you go on to page 8, line 18, reports by the Commissioner shall occur at least annually, we know that. Item G underneath that, review and approve statewide performance targets required under 193H:2. We have responsibility for H, and so that when you say performance targets, what are those, and it goes on, developed by department and recommended to the Legislative Oversight Committee by the State Board of Education. Receive reports from the State Board of Education, including the rules recommended by the department to adopt by the State Board of Education under 541A relative to the statewide performance targets required under. So targets is used in several locations within our statutes. I think that if we're going to redefine competencies, it should be done in conjunction with what we have in statute. So that's just one note, and I'm just putting these up. We're just cruising through right now, and that's something we may want to highlight and have for consideration. Are there any other identifying areas, Dr. Green? Is there anything that changes on these pages before we get into the strikeouts that you have? In other words, on page 2, or well, it starts striking out on page 3.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Thanks. Just going back to your agenda item with respect to this committee's statutory responsibilities. and I know you and I have had several conversations about this, but I'm trying to understand where this committee fits in with the process that's happening in parallel with our work. And Dr. Green's talked about you know, an upcoming April 13th state board meeting, and then hearings that Fred Bramante, you know, is going to be holding throughout the state. And where's our role in this you know, in this process?
I think our role is in accordance with what we have in statute, and
Clearly,
Yeah.
And you know, we you know, and as you pointed out, the statutory role has to do with review and approve performance targets required by law, and
if you go back to page 1,
yeah,
and it clearly states that the state board has responsibility for the minimum standards of public school approval and the academic standards. They're the ones that have to approve these. But if you go down 193E:2-A, the substantive educational content of an adequate
Yeah.
education, the minimum standards for public school approval for the areas identified in paragraph 1, that goes back up to the substantive areas, shall constitute the opportunity for delivery and adequate education. Yes, the general court shall periodically, but not less frequently than every 10 years, review, revise, update as necessary the minimum standards identified in paragraph 1, and shall ensure that the high quality of the minimum standards for public school approval in each area of education identified in paragraph 1 is maintained. Changes made by the Board of Education to the school approval standards through rulemaking after the effective date of this section shall not be included within standards that constitute the opportunity for the delivery of an adequate education without prior adoption by the general court.
So where are we reading that again? Somehow I lost your.
That's on the agenda.
Yep.
Go to the second page.
Yep, that's where I am.
Line 26 through 37, I just read.
Bottom of page 1.
Oh, yeah.
On page 1.
The general court shall periodically, but not less frequently than every 10 years, review, revise, and update as necessary the minimum standards identified in paragraph 1.
There's as we walk through these things,
Which include the minimum standards for public school.
we talk academic standards and minimum standards throughout all this, and it gets very confusing.
There's some circular stuff going on in here. Is that what you're saying?
On page 4, where you have 193C:3, the commissioner shall develop and implement this program in conjunction with the State Board of Education and the Legislative Oversight Committee. That's when we're dealing about adequacy.
I guess what I'm getting at, Mr. Chair, is I'm trying to understand if the state board has unilateral authority to schedule out a process for introducing, considering, and approving the minimum standards for public school approval without the general court's involvement or without this committee's involvement, and where this, if that's not the case, if the general court and this committee have to be involved, where are we involved in this process, and to what extent is that involvement, and
Yeah, the state board has total authority to approve the minimum standards for public school approval and the academic standards. It's written in law. However, as I read it, it's done with an effort to work with this body right here that we have where it says, in addition to the requirement in paragraph 1, shall meet performance-based indicators, and that's what we're talking about here, is some of those indicators, competencies, and statewide performance targets as approved by the Legislative Oversight Committee established in 193C. So I think it should be a collaborative effort to look at this. I know I've been asked by GELCAR, anytime rules come up that are dealing with education, would the Education Committee please look those over to see if they parallel what we have in statute and the intent of all the laws that we've written. So that's where I am right now. I think it's got to be a collaborative effort. If I'm wrong, and if the committee feels contrary to that, then it's, then maybe it's perhaps, something that we don't bother wading through this.
No, I mean, I absolutely agree that it should be a collaborative effort, but just based on what you read on line 30, but no less frequently than every 10 years, review, revise, and update. And update that's an actionable, I mean, that requires an approval to update something is an actionable thing. The minimum standards identified in paragraph 1. In paragraph 1, one of the minimum standards is the minimum standards for public school approval. In 193E1.
So I could provide a little bit of clarification.
That would be
Sure.
great. That would be
Sure.
great.
Yeah. So one of the things that we have here is there, within the handout here, you don't see 193E2, which comes between 193E1 and 193E2A. So within that section, that identifies the list of items in the minimum standards that constitute the delivery of an adequate education. And so one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the minimum standards for school approval is a very extensive document, but the legislature has defined the portion of the minimum standards that constitute the delivery of an adequate education as only about 11 items. So it's the sections on mathematics education, English education, science, and the length of a school year, and the requirements for a graduation degree. So it's the really core academic pieces, the school year piece, and the diploma piece. So there are things that are in the minimum standards.
That's in E2.
That's in E2, yes. Yeah, which is not within the handout here. So when it talks about paragraph 1, it's not referring to the paragraph 1 above on this page.
Mhm.
It's actually referring to paragraph 1 in 193E2.
Okay.
So part of the confusion, I think, is you just don't have the full statute.
Yep.
And that E2 is also identified in our responsibilities in RSA 193-C:8-A, Roman 4, where it says review and make recommendations relating to academic standards under consideration by the State Board of Education pursuant to E2.
Yeah, so if I can give you an example. In the minimum standards, there's an entire section on custodial services. And we look at that from a compliance perspective when we go out to schools. We determine whether they're providing an appropriate level of custodial services in the building to meet those minimum standards. But the court has not defined custodial services as part of the delivery of an adequate education. So when it talks about the responsibilities of this committee relative to paragraph 1, if the state board were to change the minimum standards on custodial services, this group here, the legislature, wouldn't necessarily have approval or oversight of that, because that particular part of the minimum standards is not defined within paragraph 1. Similar to nursing services or administrative and front office services, things like that.
Right. So Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Can I make a suggestion as we go through this? Could maybe this committee focus its first pass on those 11 areas that are in paragraph 1 of E:2? And
I have no problem with doing that. I just was trying to identify some areas first which were contrary with statute,
yeah.
and that we've been asked to do that by GELCAR. And so that area in competencies was one where I caught saying, hey, these are different than what we have in statute. So, and we write that statute,
Right,
not
right.
DOE.
No, I think this is good. I'm glad
Yeah,
we're having
yeah,
this.
yeah,
This.
yeah.
So, Mr. Chair, I agree with with what you're suggesting here. And as we go through and we come along to also things that fall back on the 11 areas in paragraph 1 of E2, then let's look at those too, because I think that's apparently subject to the statutory authority that this committee has.
Yeah, so I would prefer to do those substantive areas first.
Yeah.
And then come back and do what I started doing right here, hit on anything we see statutorily which doesn't parallel in these rules as we have in statute. So let's go ahead then and deal with the areas that we're discussing now. I get my,
No, that's great. Thank you.
yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. So what page would we start out on here then? It's all mixed together a little bit.
So if we're talking
Yeah.
about the 11 items,
Yeah.
where would we start? Sure.
Yeah.
So we're actually going to flip through the majority of it and go to page 33.
You're jumping over curriculum, kindergarten curriculum. That's 33.
So with under page 33, you have the original ED 306. It's been renumbered 306.25 within the section because we had to change the renumbering when we went through the draft. But the original ED 306.27 sets out requirements for graduation. That's one of the 11 items that's under the delivery of an adequate education. So within 306.27, you'll find all the requirements for a student to graduate, or the minimum requirements for a student to graduate with a New Hampshire diploma in the state. All schools are required to meet what the state has set out as a minimum. However, districts do have the authority to raise the minimum. And there are many districts that have diploma requirements that go far and above what are here in the standards. A really easy example of that is credit requirements. The state requires a minimum of 20 credits to graduate, but there are several high schools in the state that require 24 credits, 26, even some that require 27 credits.
So you're on you're starting on page 33? I would just like to walk through this thing. Is everything from 33 through the remainder of this, as you see the responsibility that would fall under our purview?
Let me double check. On page 43, this is the table and the actual requirements for a graduation diploma. And then we would actually skip over 306.28 and 29, which is just the process the department follows when we go through and measure compliance in schools. And then starting on page 50, ED 306.29, that's an arts education program. This is where all of the academic minimum standards fall in. So from page 50 through to the end of the document, this is where you're going to find all the different academic programs.
Okay.
And so on the agenda, when you look at statute 193E2A, as you were quoting there, Representative Ladd, changes made by the Board of Education to the school approval standards through rulemaking after the effective date of this section shall not be included within the standards that constitute the opportunity for the delivery of an adequate education without prior adoption by the general court. So this is something that we've talked a little bit about internally as well, as to what does this process look like? At what point do we involve, the House and Senate Education, or this Oversight Committee, or the general court at large? Because there does seem to be a little bit of a conflict between the state board having authority to move through rulemaking and adopt new rules, but then to not have those rules actually be the rules that apply to an adequate education without prior adoption by the court. So it seems like there's a twofold process here, that the state board can adopt new rules, but that those new rules don't represent what constitutes an adequate education until the general court also adopts them. Now, we haven't necessarily put this particular process into place before. We have made changes in the past, and it's gone through the normal process of rulemaking. A good example of this would be in 2018, the legislature added computer science into 193E2A in those 11 items. Computer science had never been part of that before, it was added in. And then because it was added into the definition of an adequate education, the state board then went through its process and adopted rules relative to computer science. And those are now in the minimum standards. But when the state board did that, they went through the normal rulemaking process. It went to JELCAR and then it was approved and came back. So there wasn't necessarily a secondary approval by the general court, but you could almost look at that as the general court had initially approved it by adding computer science into the statute in the first place. So I think we're in a little bit of uncharted territories here where we haven't actually gone through a process that involves rulemaking and involves approval from the general court as part of that rulemaking process.
But didn't we pass a law? Didn't we, in this committee, we reviewed the issue of computer literacy, and wasn't that part of the piece of legislation that we did pass?
Oh, yeah, that is part of the required delivery of an adequate education right now, as a component. We've done it several times. We've also modified mathematics with the embedded math course. I understand some of the conflict here. I don't want to get into the business of a pocket veto here, that, you know, we pass some legislation and we're telling you to make rules and then we're going to veto those rules. So I've always been cautioned, and now Anthony's no longer there, about using that. But I am concerned that when it says academic standards, we have a clear responsibility for reviewing those academic standards, as we passed in legislation last year with the Oversight Committee that we have right here, where it speaks specifically to the academic standards.
Yes, so in 193C, when we talk about academic standards, those are the academic standards we use for our assessment system. So those are the next generation science standards and the Common Core state standards for math and for English. And so those are separate from the minimum standards. One of the things that we're working on, and that I believe you'll hear tomorrow during House Education, Senate Bill 266 is a cleanup bill, and that goes through many of the sections that you have here in front of you and clarifies the difference between minimum standards versus academic standards versus academic targets versus learning targets, because there is some confusion in there, and there are academic standards within the minimum standards, but when we talk about 193C in the state assessment, those academic standards are separate from the minimum standards. And this oversight committee does have some authority over both of those two pieces, but it gets a little bit convoluted as to which ones we're talking about depending on which piece of the statute we're reading. And we've tried to do some cleanup on that bill that you'll hear tomorrow.
The law is very, you know, it takes a lot of interpretation, especially when you look at 193H, and that creates some issues, and that's the areas which I've read where I get some of this conflict. So we agree right now that we can move forward. I'm not saying I agree,
Sure.
but
What was the cleanup bill that Nate was referring to?
SB 266, you said?
What?
Yes,
Say it again?
SB 266.
Okay.
we're going to be hearing that bill, and I have
Right.
Jennifer Ford is doing a real good job of doing it side by side
Oh, excellent.
on that, along with some of the other components of what that whole thing conveys.
Isn't it on Wednesday?
It's scheduled this week, Wednesday or Thursday. I think it may be on Wednesday morning.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and we will have that side by side
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
later work.
So the majority of that bill, or not the majority, the entirety of that bill is something that Caitlin and I put together. It's a cleanup bill to really clarify exactly this kind of conversation we're having here. So the majority of that does not change policy. It really just takes the statute, aligns it with current practice in the field, current department practice, and then attempts to really separate out what's a minimum standard versus what's an academic standard, and what the authority of the department is, what LEAs need to do in order to implement the statewide assessment system.
Kind of glad that bill's coming forward because it gives us an opportunity to do some things. Okay, so from the perspective of those on the committee here right now, would you like to just start walking through these components that are dealing with the areas that were just discussed by Nate?
So,
Would that be starting on page 50 then?
Or
Are we
on
talking
page
about-
Weston, didn't we have something down on page 33?
So we have not, at this point, nothing in this draft has changed the requirements for a diploma in New Hampshire. So that would be a responsibility within the adequate education, but we haven't changed that in any way. There most likely will be some changes to that, or there may be some changes to that as it moves through the state board process. And that's simply because of a particular piece of legislation that passed this past session that added personal financial literacy into the requirements for a minimum adequate education. Right now, the minimum standards have not been updated to reflect that addition. And so we need to put some kind of clarification or some kind of change into the minimum standards that directly showcases how personal financial literacy fits within a high school education for students in New Hampshire as a result of that statute that passed last year.
Okay, can we jump back down to page 33, 34, and I do have a question there. I see some areas that have been struck. On page 34, item number 4 there, but also getting down to the bottom part of that page where we're changing mastery to proficiency. Can you explain why that?
Yes, so we've tried to clarify language throughout this document relative to competencies. When the minimum standards were first drafted to move New Hampshire towards a competency-based system, we're talking more than 10 years ago at this point. And so it was a very new thing, and we were using relatively new language to describe something that was not current practice in the field. Now schools and districts have had more than a decade to implement competency-based systems, to bring that into the classroom, to look at how it affects things like instructional practices and grading practices. And one of the things that we want to be really, really careful and pay attention to in the standards is the actual language itself. Within a competency-based framework, there are 2 different levels where a student can attain a mark that allows them to move forward. One of those is proficient, and one of those is mastery. And so oftentimes within a school, you'll see 4 different levels, a 1, 2, 3, and a 4. 1 means below proficient, 2 means approaching proficient, 3 means proficient, and 4 is a mastery. And so what we want within the minimum standards is to ensure that all students reach a proficient level. Students should be proficient across all the competencies associated with the course. Some students are going to move beyond proficient, and they will reach a level of mastery. And because that tends to be the language that's used through most of the field, if we say that all students must reach a level of mastery of competencies, we're expecting a higher level of attainment than we were previously expecting out of our students right now. So we want, at a minimum, all students to be proficient, understanding that many of our students will attain mastery. One of the things, I believe in the definition section, we've clarified around that. We put a definition in as to what proficiency is. And proficiency, let me make sure that it's in this particular draft.
Yep, page 2.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Proficiency means the minimum student performance required to satisfy the acknowledgement of a competency, and is distinguished from mastery, which is a level of performance that exceeds proficiency.
So that's in law right now. Proficiency on page 2. Or statute. I mean.
No, so that's a new definition.
That's a new definition then. So am I to assume then that on page 1, 2, et cetera, that's all new? No.
Some of this is new, some of it is not.
Where are you referring to now, Rick?
I'm
Page
right
2.
back on page 1 and 2 again, where we started,
Back to page 1.
asking the question,
Yeah.
because that would explain to me, see, competencies, which is in the old rules
Right.
here, states differently than competencies here.
Yes.
Was that a conscious decision on that group that worked to make that change? Versus saying competencies mean student learning targets that represent, and then it goes into what you have basically within competency right now. But competencies are targets. They're targeted at a certain level that we consider in 1, 2, 3, or 4 as being a proficient level, or below proficient, or significantly below proficient.
So that was a change. So learning targets means something slightly different than competencies. And so I would actually recommend that we move towards this definition and look at changing the particular definition within the statute, because that aligns more closely with what the field is currently using. A competency is just a single sentence. And as within that single sentence, it should identify what the student should know or what the student should be able to do. It's a set of knowledge or it's a set of skills. Sometimes it's a combination of both of those things. The learning target is a measurement, 1, 2, 3, or 4, of how the student is performing relative to the competency statement. So the competency statement isn't necessarily a learning target. It's just a statement of what it is that we want the students to be able to do once they've reached the end of a particular course or learning opportunity, an ELO, whatever it is that the student is participating in.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I think you're on a very important quest here to really make sure we understand the distinction of the terms competency, competency-based, and proficiency, and I think others as well. And I know we're sort of, flipping back and forth through this draft document, but on page 35, sort of where you were starting, Rick, earlier, there's significant changes at the bottom of page, on the bottom half of page 35, where it talks about rules relative to not just an arts education or business education, but a competency-based arts education program and a competency-based business education program. And through all of those items that are defined, those academic items that are defined, or those program of study items that are defined in 193 E2A,
Yeah.
and the definition on page 1, where it says competency-based assessment, so it's a little bit different than competency-based education program. But competency-based assessment, I imagine it relates to it, means an assessment of student proficiency, so now we've got the word proficiency in there, with regards to one or more competencies. And I think this is what Nate was just talking about, the statement of the knowledge or skills.
So an example, so for a little over 10 years, I was a high school chemistry teacher up in the Lakes region. And so when I developed curriculum for my juniors, I had a set of anywhere between about 10 and 11 competencies associated with the chemistry course that I taught. One of those competencies, was something like students will understand the structure and function of the atom. And so at a very basic level, it's a set of knowledge that we want students to have as a result of taking a chemistry course. Students will understand the atom that's made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and how those different subatomic particles function together to create the basic building blocks of the universe. But then the learning targets are going to be those level 1, 2, 3, 4. So as a teacher, I would assess my students through a variety of homework, and quizzes, and projects, and labs to determine, is a student proficient in understanding the structure of an atom? Has a student reached a level of mastery in understanding the structure of the atom? Or is a student approaching proficient? Are they not proficient? So those targets are really the grading system that exists in a competency-based system, but the competency is just that statement of the knowledge that I want the student to have at the end of the course.
Right, but could the competency be assessed without necessarily the student going through and achieving those learning targets that you've talked about? So you know, the chemistry class you teach might be different than the chemistry class another teacher teaches. And so the learning targets that you've laid out to demonstrate a competency might be very different than the learning targets another chemistry teacher might have laid out to determine a competency. But the how am I saying? When you assess students using your formative and summative assessments, tests, quizzes, things like that, those are based on learning targets. And then at the end of the day, when you sort of make that sort of summative, did the student meet the district's competency? You can sort of see from the tests whether or not they achieved that. But going through that, through those learning, what did you call them again? The learning targets?
So probably a better word, I know, I'm using learning targets because I'm trying to match it to some of the language here. A much better use of the word would be rubrics. I would
Right,
say
okay,
the
I'm
vast
familiar
majority of
with
teachers are using rubrics to
Yeah.
assess students across a variety of different learning opportunities. That's the core function of a teacher, right? And it's
Right.
absolutely going to be, I mean, it was different in our building. I taught at Belmont High School. We had a department of 4 science teachers, but I wasn't necessarily doing the exact same thing in my classroom as maybe a teacher in our science department across
Right.
the hall was doing. But I think those are what teachers do. They change their instruction based off the students they have, based off of where their students are at, where they're trying to get them to go. Even sometimes it's personal preference. There might be a lab that I really enjoy doing as a teacher with my students, and another teacher's like, I don't want to do that lab, I'm going to do a different lab. But the core result is that we're trying to get students to that competency. This is what we want all of our students to understand, at least at a proficient level. And then here are all the different opportunities that we're providing as a teacher instructionally, and here's how we're assessing those students using rubrics to get them to that point where we can say, yes, this student is proficient, or this student has mastered that competency.
So, well, I guess my brain just doesn't want to stop.
It's hard on a Monday morning.
It's hard on a Monday morning, especially when it's so nice outside. I mean, start, not stop. But,
Yeah.
Are we, by doing what you're proposing through these rules, where you're making some changes to statutory language, are you putting the cart in front of the horse? In other words, shouldn't the statutory language be changed first? Then the rules are based off of statutory language, not reverse.
Yes, absolutely, I would agree with that. And to be honest, I didn't realize that there was that definition of a competency within statute. If I had known that, we would have taken a look at that as well in conjunction with this work, and most likely would have offered up changes to that particular statute. Only because the current definition of competencies in statute represents an older thinking that doesn't match with what the current practice in the field is today.
So isn't a better way to change this is not through doing it through rules, but 266?
Yeah, that would be an excellent vehicle to change the wording of that particular statute. Yeah, and especially because at the department level, when we talk about targets and performance targets, we're usually talking about things at a school level, not at a student level. So competencies are measurements of student knowledge and learning. When we talk about the learning targets within statute, those are generally the targets we've set out in our state ESSA plan, where we're looking at the overall achievement of a school. You know, what's the proficiency level of Bosquen Elementary School or Concord High School? Those are the learning targets that we have set actual targets at the state that we can measure. And those aren't at a student-specific level, it's an aggregate level. So saying 60% of students are proficient in X or 52% of students are proficient in Y. Those are generally the learning targets that we've set. So it doesn't match, when we start talking about competencies, the state isn't setting learning targets for competencies. Competencies are very much a part of local school curriculum, and are developed generally by districts, by curriculum administrators, by teachers that are teaching those subjects. We do have state model competencies, and some schools and districts use some of our state model competencies, but I would not call them learning targets. And that's why I say I think the definition probably needs to be edited or changed, because it doesn't match everywhere else in statute where we talk about learning targets, which is at a school level. If that's helpful. I know some of this is, it's part of our cleanup bill that Caitlin and I have worked on, is because we want to make sure that we're implementing the law effectively and to the extent that the law is requiring us to do that. And sometimes the confusion within the statute makes it difficult for us, even at the department, to implement some of these particular pieces because there are some contradictions or language overlaps with itself.
So the academic standards which we have for mathematics, we have certain targeted levels that we identify as proficient or not proficient, correct?
Yeah, and that's specific to the state assessment. So a student who takes
And that's
the
set by
state
the
test.
state, not by the local.
Correct. Yep.
And then we identify with an assessment which measures whether the student is proficient or not, the statewide assessment. And that has to be aligned with these 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Or we align a 1, 2, 3, and 4 with that assessment, and proficient might be 38%, I don't know, or it might be 70%. That's,
So it was a pretty extensive process. So when we first moved from the kneecap, which was our previous state assessment, to using our current NHSAS, and SAS just stands for Statewide Assessment System, we spent actually several days bringing teachers in from the field and working with our testing vendor, who was AIR at the time. And the teachers sat down and they took the test and they went item by item and they identified in their content area for their grade level. So if I'm a 5th grade math teacher, I'm looking at 5th grade test items and I'm identifying, yes, a student's performance on this test item to me as a 5th grade math teacher in New Hampshire would represent proficiency or mastery or not approaching proficiency. And they went through the test and we took all of that feedback from all those teachers and the content areas and the grade levels, and that's what we developed our 1, 2, 3, 4 scales from. And so essentially there are ranges of performance. So if a student scores, if I make up some numbers here, say like between a 230 and a 280 on the 3rd grade math test, we've determined that range represents proficiency. Now, if they're above that, they're above proficiency. If they're below that, they're below proficient. But all of that was determined by New Hampshire teachers who went through the test. It was a long and sometimes contentious process because you have different teachers that have different ideas and definitions of what proficiency might be. And I say that from firsthand experience because I was one of the teachers that participated back in 2017-18 in that process for science.
I understand where you're coming from. I couldn't get teachers between the elementary and the high school level to agree on some math discussions which we had, and doing it statewide, imagine that's quite a task. I'm just to follow up to where we've been then, we have defined within 193E2A the substantive criteria that we consider that for an adequate education. And I'm trying to find that page right. It goes from English language arts, reading, math, science, social studies, etc., arts, world languages. The state board has identified next generation as the academic standards. From that is for measuring throughout the state. Based off of that, we have the Common Core in mathematics, or something that a district that meets that and goes beyond. And I believe the same thing for language arts. But what about all those other areas that we have as the education content of an adequate education? How do we measure they're competent in these areas if we don't have any standards which we've established?
So at a statewide level, right now we just assess in math, English language arts, and science. I know that there's been discussion, over the past 10 years, 15 years around social studies and whether that should also be, assessed at a statewide level. But all of the other subject areas, New Hampshire's never had a statewide assessment in it. Some states do approach measuring competency in other subjects. Some of them approach that by having a statewide test at the end of a particular high school course, that every student has to take that particular test to pass the course. New Hampshire's never gone down that road. I don't necessarily see us going down that road, but that's to have a statewide level of student performance. You would have to have some kind of common statewide assessment in a particular subject. Some of the areas in there may not make sense to have a common assessment. For example, world languages. Even though world languages is identified as a criteria for an adequate education, districts have to offer world languages, but there's no requirement that students have to take it. And so we wouldn't have a statewide assessment of, say, French or Spanish, because students may never take any foreign language, or they may take Latin, or they may take Russian, depending on what their districts offer. So it gets a little bit trickier when you get into some of the other subject areas. Arts and business education is another great example. Some students may fulfill their arts credit requirements by taking pottery and ceramics and drawing. Other students may fulfill their arts credit by taking band and chorus and theater. And so when you kind of spread those other, what we tend to think of more as like elective credits out, it's much, much harder to have any kind of student assessment that's common that would give us any measurable data at a state level.
So then we basically default some of those areas to the local to develop the level of competency or proficiency in that.
Yeah, and I would say the vast majority of our districts are using the same standards. So there are national art standards that are available that we have on our website. So we have there's a page on the department website that lists out several sets of national standards in most of those areas. So there's national business education standards, art standards. We do have New Hampshire social studies standards framework that's available on our website. And many districts are using those standards as they build their curriculum. So I would say through most districts in the state, there is probably consistency within standards. There may be some districts here and there that are using other sets of standards. I know there's some districts on our southern border that use some standards that they pull from Massachusetts, just because they happen to be close to the border and there are high quality Massachusetts standards available in a particular subject. But again, I would say for the most part, most people are using those national standards in each subject area.
So basically then, when it came to science, we did next generation science. And for the math, we went with that other common core. But for social studies, even though we do have the old report from 2008 or so, I believe it was, the standards there, which, it does identify certain things for certain levels of competence. But that's the only area, so when it comes to like civics, and we have another bill coming to us here on civics education, recommending certain things for certain grade levels, which may be contrary to the academic standards which we have in place right now. If those are academic standards, those used to be guidelines. I guess, Nate, where I'm really confused is, what are our academic standards? And I got it from mathematics, seeing if the Common Core is it, that's the minimum standards right there. For science, I get it, but I don't get it for any of these other subject areas. So we're leaving this wide open, and yet we're in the minimum standards for public school approval. We're writing down some of the things. Are those becoming our standards?
No, so the minimum standards are written at a program and a school level. So if you look at the minimum standards, for example, for math, those are the standards that a school has to follow when they're offering a mathematics program to all of their students. That's different than the Common Core math standards, which identifies what each individual student needs to do at each grade level. So one of the things you won't find in the minimum standards is what a 5th grade student needs to do in math, because that's not the job of the minimum standards. The job of the minimum standards is to ensure that schools have a mathematics program that's K-12, that is sequential, that brings students through based upon proficiency within a defined set of competencies, and that offers certain mathematical opportunities for students to progress in their learning. So, in a way, it's two different purposes. The minimum standards tell us what we have to do as a department when we go look at a school. The academic standards tell teachers what they have to teach to each individual student in their classroom when they're teaching a particular course, like 5th grade math or geometry or algebra 2. The other thing that makes this a little bit tricky is we have a statute in New Hampshire that says the state board can adopt all of these different standards, but local districts do not have to use them. So even though we've adopted the next generation science standards, and the state board has said this is what we're going to use to build our science test, a district does not have to use the next generation science standards to build their curriculum. A district does have to follow the minimum standards. So for example, a district could not say, we're not going to teach chemistry. The minimum standards require them to teach chemistry. But when a teacher goes to actually teach chemistry and determine what's appropriate at a particular grade level, they're going to go to the next generation science standards and look to see what should juniors be learning in chemistry at that particular grade level.
Rick?
Representative Leno?
Yeah, so, Rick, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not even sure I understand the mathematics part in this, and I think that's a good one to take a look at. Earlier I was looking at pages 35 and 36, sort of over where Chair Ladd got us started, and on the top of page 36, it refers to Ed 306.38 relative to a competency-based mathematics program. So I found that on, Ed 306.38, competency-based mathematics program. I found that on page 70, which says the local, and I'm reading it with the, trying to read the revised language. The school board shall provide a mathematics program at each elementary school consistent with competencies determined pursuant to Ed 306-24, which may include, and then it talks about opportunities to solve problems, opportunities to build and construct knowledge, opportunities for authentic tasks, and it goes down. But then you swing over to 306-24, which is on page 30. And kindergarten through grade 8 school curriculum, the board shall require that in each school there is a broadened, well-balanced elementary school curriculum, a learning program that includes procedures, methods, research-based learning opportunities, techniques, provision. I guess I'm not seeing, the math isn't jumping out at me. And I'm not seeing it reflect back, because this is the minimum standards for school approval.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing it tie in with what what I think you're talking about, which are the academic standards for in this case, math.
My concern, I guess, is that we have defaulted to the local school district has responsibility for curriculum and instruction. But it also seems to me that they're setting academic standards too in some of these areas. And
So
I'd like to go on a little bit farther and discuss next generation science standards. I'm looking at the minutes from back in November 3, 2016 of the State Board. Chairman Raffio made the following motion, seconded by Gregory Odell, that the State Board of Education adopts the performance expectations of next generation science standards as the academic standards for New Hampshire College and Career Ready science standards. I further move that the State Board of Education begin the rulemaking process as it relates to academic science standards, and that the Department of Education commit to supporting school districts in implementing diverse educational approaches to instruction and curriculum tailored to meet student needs. So what I'm seeing here is it was very specific motion that we now have next generation as our academic standards. And Mr. Local School District, you have responsibility for implementing these through your instruction and your curriculum. I don't see any latitude for a school district to not use those standards unless they want to exceed with some other standards. I'm under the impression that's the way all our standards should be held. How should we hold local school districts accountable for this standard? We can't have standards that are different from school district to school district, and that's where I think we're starting to tilt. And perhaps in mathematics in some of the areas, we're picking it up on our achievement scores.
So the place where that gets pulled in, and maybe we can make it a little bit clearer in the minimum standards, but right at the beginning of the 306.24, under A1, where you're talking about a broad and well-balanced elementary school curriculum, this is what the school board has to provide, that outlines competencies for the grade 1 through 8 program in compliance with RSA 193C3.3. So that statute there, RSA 193C3, is where those academic standards are coming from. So the authority of the state board to adopt academic standards like next generation science standards or the Common Core for math and English language arts, that's that 193 section. So the minimum standards here are saying to districts, as a school board, you need to have an elementary school curriculum that outlines competencies in compliance with RSA 193C3, which are those academic standards. The problem then is that when you go to the statute essentially says what you're saying, which is the state's going to adopt academic standards, but districts can choose to use other standards if they're, other national, high quality or well-recognized standards. So that's that circular piece. The minimum standards do require that school boards build a curriculum that is in line with standards, but then the statute allows districts to use a different set of standards if they choose.
If they meet the standards the state board approved, meet or exceed the state. That's the way it was when we adopted the math standards. There was some that say, we don't want Common Core. But so we're gonna have the latitude. It was also at the same time we were doing PACE.
Yes, yep.
And so I have no problem with a school district meeting or exceeding those standards. But we need to maintain that standard that the state board sets. And we gotta somehow, I as working on statewide education here in this guy, I gotta be guaranteed that we are not dipping down and because we're also not assessing some of these areas, so we're just kind of like letting the school districts do as they want right now. Am I way off base or
No, I don't think so. So again, I think the vast majority of districts do use the standards that the state board has adopted.
Yeah.
I can't tell you offhand a district I know of that doesn't use those particular standards. And one of the reasons for that is that districts know that all their students are going to take a state test that has been built off of those state adopted standards. So if a district were to develop a wildly different curriculum that does not match with state adopted standards, and then their students take the state test, their performance is probably not going to match up with the performance of any other student in the state because they're now being assessed on a different set of standards. And so I think just from the sheer fact that schools know they're being held accountable using the state test, the majority of schools use those standards. The other reason is those standards are widely used by other districts. There's a lot of resources and curriculum built around those standards. It's a lot more work for a district to use something else than what the state is providing, given all of the resources and all of the instructional support that's available around the current standards.
do teachers in the buildings know what these academic standards are when they're looking at, and the superintendent comes down or the school board comes down and says, folks, I want you to adopt the new math program. I want you to adopt this. So in the adoption process, are they looking at these standards or are they just saying, oh, here's a program we think it's going to fill our holes? And is what we're adopting aligned with the measure we're using to hold them to accountability?
I think most teachers do know the standards. They probably know those academic standards far more than they know, minimum standards or statute. And that's because those academic standards are what teachers use to build their curriculum. In fact, I know many teachers that can quote particular sections of the academic standards far better than I could, and I work with this stuff on a pretty regular basis. But I live more within the world of rule and statute. Teachers live very much within that world of academic standards.
Shall we move on with a little bit of the discussion here? So, can we start with the subject areas or the substantive criteria areas? That jumps way up there, but I'd like to try to wade through some of that.
Which page you got?
It was up around 40-something,
Is
something,
that 50?
50?
50. So, and I can probably make the task a little bit easier.
Yes.
For the majority of the academic components within here, the only edits were made to that first paragraph.
Okay.
So everything else that falls underneath there is the same as the current minimum standards. So if you're looking at page 50, an arts education program, you see paragraph A has been revised, but then there are no other changes to an arts education program. So all of that remains the same.
Are you talking about all through what page?
Through to the very end of the document.
So what about all the strikeouts on page 57 and 58?
So there are a couple, I want to say, there's a couple strikeouts within science. And then, let's
I'm
see,
talking about
57 is CTE, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this one, we met with a group that represented CTE teachers and directors, and we took out specific components here around assessment because they felt it was limiting by calling out exactly what kinds of assessments they had to use. They felt like they were limited to using those assessments in the classroom. So we pulled that particular piece out, and that allows CTE programs to use a wide variety of assessments and not feel that they're limited to only using this particular list. And I believe we did that in one other area. In most of the other academic areas, it says that the school shall use an assessment program consistent with ED 306. I think it's 2.3 now, which talks about all the different ways that schools can assess students. And so we wanted to keep it really broad for schools so that they would have a wide variety of assessment instruments to use in their classrooms.
So does that still, on page 57, I've always been really kind of liking the item which you struck here is number 5, third-party technical assessments that are aligned with industry standards as recognized and designated by the department. I don't know if I, agree with the department, but the industry standards are what we're trying to prepare students for. When we have somebody that comes in and assesses a student whether they know how to weld properly, there's an industry standard for that. Shouldn't we still incorporate that, or is it wide open when we say formative and summative instruments up top?
Yeah, I would say, particularly for CTE programs, they're using industry recognized assessments across the board.
Yeah.
For exactly what you're talking about. If you've got kids doing electrical programs, they're taking assessments that are created by the industry that is then going to employ some of those students when they come out into the field of electrician. Same thing with like plumbing and HVAC. Same thing with culinary, welding. So those are being used widely right now across all the programs. I think one of the fears is sometimes when, and other people have come with this particular question as well, like, they'll see something and say, you've struck this out, does that mean now that schools aren't going to do it? And I would say no, because that's already a key integral component. The minimum standards set the minimum of what programs need to do. I would say most of our CTE programs already go far above and beyond in terms of what they do in partnership with industries that their students are moving into. And then the language itself here, in paragraph E, it talks about schools must use multiple formative and summative assessment instruments. And then it gives a list of, here are some examples that you can use, but you can also use many more things beyond this. And so there are places where if we had a list that said, can include but not be limited to, and the actual definition was already wide open, it didn't necessarily make sense to have a list in here, unless we felt like that list was really something that needed to be said or needed to be put out there. But this is already a component of most CTE programs. and is most likely a component of the federal requirements for many of our CT programs as well. And those programs do receive federal funds, and they're expected to meet certain requirements as a result of that funding.
Rick?
Yes.
So you're saying here that the items that have been struck here for CTE, that those are all recommended by the CTE directors, et cetera?
Yeah, so we one of the people that was on the group that we worked with was Jeff Beard, who is the current acting administrator or he's the administrator over the CTE programs for the state. And he had taken this language out to his group as well to ask them, are there changes that you want to see reflected within this document? So this doesn't necessarily change any practice in the field. It just removes a list of potential assessments that districts in their CT programs could use. But the paragraph E already opens up their assessment program to use any formative and summative assessments that that program wants to use.
You know, I'd love to see you up top there in that item E to put multiple formative, summative assessments, and strike out or take out something out of 5 there, which industry standards assessments or that are aligned with our state and district content and performance standards. What about industry standards? I don't know. I think that that's a very important area that we're trying to move to in our career pathways and working with the community college system. We're basing a lot of those programs on industry standard, and there's no mention of that there at all. I know it says examples of such assessments. I think it's worthy to elevate something up in there in that E, which references those industry standards.
Yeah, we could certainly add that in. In some of this, there were pretty extensive conversations about, where should we add things in? How do we craft that language? How do we get the intent across that this is what a high quality program should look like? Sometimes it was just a matter of pulling out places where we felt like it may have been repetitive. If you look on page 56, there are several requirements of CTE programs to work with industry groups. So under paragraph C1,
Yeah.
one of the required groups that they must work with are national industry standards adherence, state industry economic initiatives, labor demands, and then in paragraph 3 under C, it actually refers to several New Hampshire state-specific industries that CT programs are required to work with as well. And I would agree that CT programs are very industry driven. There's a lot of industry involvement in our CT programs because that represents a direct career pathway for many of our students that are going through that.
Okay. Are multiple formative and summative assessments, does that include industry assessments or?
And we could certainly add that language in
No.
to ensure that, whatever the assessments that they're using, they're including those industry assessments.
Let's move on if there's no more on the CTE.
Well, yeah, on page
Okay.
60, page 62 is your next major
Yeah.
deletion. What was the reason for that? On page 62,
62.
yeah, you struck the experience that supports students' 20th century learning.
So those particular paragraphs, some of that is already covered within the national standards for a family and consumer science program. And then much of it is just a slightly more granular dive into what's in paragraph B right before that.
Is there any area in here where you have reference to personal finance literacy?
No, because when this project first kind of got off the ground and was moving forward, it was prior to the adoption of the new statute this past year. So it's something that we had started to talk about, but adding that into the definition of an adequate education really is more in the purview of what direction does the state board want to take it in. So outside groups could make some recommendations. I think the questions that we're facing right now with regards to personal financial literacy is, should it be a graduation requirement or not? What level of course should it be? Should it be a half credit? Should it be a full credit? Is there a particular point within a student's high school career that they need to take that? Those are pretty large decisions around things that will affect the diploma requirements for a student. And so the group felt that they wanted to bring that to the state board and make that part of the public feedback process that the state board is now going to undergo with how do we take a new subject, a new course here that's been added to an adequate education and fit that into the minimum standards.
We previously had personal finance literacy in rulemaking when it came to economics, and it also referenced, I'm trying to go back and look at that.
It is in the graduation requirements as
Yes.
a component of economics. So right now, students are
credit.
required to take a half credit of economics, which may include personal finance, and it's that may.
Yeah.
So the question now is, should there be a standalone personal finance course? And if there is a standalone personal finance course, should it be required for graduation? And if that's the case, does that replace economics? Does it become an elective? Do we increase our minimum 20 credits to 20 and a half? Does something get pulled out? So I think those are questions that the state board is going to take up as part of this process.
When we wrote that legislation, we also referenced it under studies. And it said that it could be embedded in a course, it could be a separate course, it was a local decision.
Yeah, and so as we've started to implement under the studies particular, that part of the statute, one of the questions districts have had is it doesn't reference a specific grade level. And so a district could meet that particular statute by embedding personal finance in 5th grade. And they've now met the requirement as the statute is written. Now,
We're looking at it as a high school, but now if
Right.
we look at it in terms of everything else we have under a substance education content, it doesn't say grade level. It just says science, just says mathematics, just says personal finance literacy.
and
So,
that's where the minimum standards then give that further clarification. So if we're talking about world languages, what does it mean to have world languages as a part of an adequate education? And
So-
that's where the minimum standards then clarifies
so
it.
without mention of it right here in your rules, when it also references school approval standards up top on 190E2, I would think you'd have some mention of personal finance literacy in your proposed rules.
Yeah, it needs to be in there. Again, I think that's gonna be a key component of the state board discussion and what direction they wanna go with that as well, yeah.
So noted. Okay. Any other areas that you might see that,
On page 63, there's again, there's a deletion and referred back to 306-22, which deals with assessment. And I'm assuming those, Nate, that those were eliminated because you felt that they were covered in 306-22, is that correct?
Yes,
Because you did add, you added B under 22.
so under ED 306.22, on page 27, paragraph 2 lists out a pretty extensive list of examples of ways in which teachers can assess students. And so that's why we struck it from those two areas in the back of the minimum standards and referred to this list. One, because this list is more comprehensive. It includes everything that's struck out there. So it's not gone, it's just that there were two academic areas that referenced a list of specific assessments, and the rest of them didn't. The rest of them referred back to this section. And we felt it was appropriate to just have all of the academic areas refer to the same assessment section, which gives a comprehensive list. And this talks about educator observations of project-based learning, competency-based and performance-based assessments, educator observations of student performance, project evaluation rubrics, and then this also goes into professional development for teachers around assessment.
Yeah, the one thing though that I didn't see, again, that we're dealing with cursory look here, item 1 that talks about individual student performance, a summary of individual student performance to parents at least 4 times per course. And as you deal with just a parental involvement in understanding where their child is that somewhere else on the assessment as far as reporting back to parents about that?
Yes, so on page 28, and this is another reason why we struck that,
Okay.
is there was conflict. I think within the family consumer science, it required teachers to report 4 times a year. On page 28, it requires all courses to report 3 times a year. So there was a contradiction between 3 times versus 4 times.
Thank
Yep.
you.
When I look at the area of health we were just looking at, and I look at what's in current rule, it's totally different
For which one?
for health. On page,
66.
on page 64, going through 66, when I'm looking at, I'm just trying to, okay, that's what I'm saying. Systematic instruction, A through H, E.
But again, on
Not totally, but it changes.
But on 66, when you deal with the assessment, again, you're referring back then to 22, right?
Yes. That also helps to set a consistent assessment program for all subject areas, so that you don't have a different list for health and a different list for family consumer science. If you look in the math, ELA, and science sections, there isn't even a list. And so it was odd to us as we read through the different sections to see some academic programs had prescribed lists of assessments and others did not. And we felt it was appropriate to have a comprehensive list of assessment practices that would apply across the board.
So what you're saying then, that as you look at these areas of study, the areas of study have not been changed as much as how those areas of studies are now have a consistent assessment, and you basically have changed the assessment process, but not the content of those areas.
Correct, yeah, and we've tried to make it more comprehensive, so it includes any and all ways that a teacher might assess their students in their classroom.
Nate, one question here. I'm looking at the book right here. We went through a real fiasco back in 2014-15 when the department went past their deadline for modifying some of these things. Were the changes based off the 2014 model, or what was being proposed for 2015? Are you following where I am?
I am, so I would, from 2015 till now, there have been small changes to the minimum standards probably each year. And so these changes are based off of what's currently on the GenCourt website that's been approved by GELCAR, which probably does not match the 2014-15 version.
It's not matching what I have in front of me.
Yeah, my guess is that 14-15 version is out of date, yeah. It's probably similar, but there are gonna be places where it does not match the current minimum standards.
Rick?
Yes.
Could Dr. Green talked a little bit about what's going on at the bottom of page 8 with what's struck out there in what was part 25, and then what continues, and there's a substantial amount of material removed at the bottom of page 9, well, actually all of
Through
page
10.
9, and page 10, and page 11.
Yep.
And, you know, this committee, I think, has been very involved, particularly in revising school safety and discipline policies over the last several years, right?
Yes.
I'm just wondering what happened to those.
They were moved to earlier in the document. So, for example,
Well, it's on page 8, so.
yes.
Not much.
Not much more.
Yeah, there's.
So with page 8, so the list that kind of goes down through like the first half of page 9,
Yeah.
most of that now has been moved to ED 306.27, so that's later in the document.
Okay.
And then the rest of this is relative to policies, which is now, we tried to put all the policy sections together at the beginning. So for example, you'll see, let's see where it is, on page 9, paragraph C is a policy relative to absenteeism and attendance that's been struck out.
Mm-hmm.
You'll now find that on page 3, and now it's paragraph 1. And it's the same, we've cleaned it up. So now instead of just one long paragraph, we took all the information that was in paragraph on page 9 and put it into a bulleted list on page 3, so it's more readable.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the exact same requirements for the policy. And then similarly, on page 9, the next policy is relative to school safety. You'll find that as paragraph 2 on page 3. And it, again, we've tried to clean it up a little bit, set it out in bullets, make it a little bit more readable and clear to anybody who might be reading the minimum standards. And so most of what's struck out on page 9, 10, and 11 is now on page 3, 4, and 5.
Okay.
We have not removed policies from this document. It does look like a lot of things have been added as new and struck out, and that's simply because we reorganized it. We went through the whole document, anywhere we found the word policy, and it was scattered through all 70 pages. We put into section 30604, which is specific to policy development. That way, if you're a principal or a superintendent, you want to know what policies are we required to have in our district, there's one place in the minimum standards now where you can find that list, as opposed to having to read all 80 pages and find everywhere it uses the word policy.
Right. Thanks, Nate. And I think that's a good, that's certainly a good improvement as far as usability. But I just want to make sure that we're not losing any detail, particularly if a policy refers back to a statute, and I do see some statutory references in here, but particularly on in the areas concerning student discipline, suspensions, things like that.
Yeah.
Where I think we've tried to take a very careful and equitable approach to how public schools carry out those responsibilities, and as far as safety is concerned too, because I think people generally agree that safety is clearly, if we do nothing else, we keep kids safe. Absolutely. During the day. So hopefully we do a lot of other things too, but that's certainly an important dimension that we don't want to lose.
Yeah, I can tell you there's nothing relative to student safety or school safety that's been taken out of this document.
Okay.
And any statutory references continue to remain, because we wouldn't have the authority to remove anything that is required by statute. Things like restraint, seclusion, school safety practices, yeah.
Right.
Everything related to bullying is all still within the minimum standards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
It does look scary because I know there's a lot of, it looks like there's new material, it looks like there's a lot of deletions, and it really was, the policy part was a cleanup.
Mhm.
And we reviewed all of that as well with the Superintendent's Association and the School Board Association. So they have a good understanding of, here's the policy requirements for the minimum standards.
Mm-hmm.
And we really have not changed that, we just cleaned it up.
Okay, good, good.
Okay, I'm smiling as I look at the first paragraph on page 3. We've had this conversation before on the availability of, if schools are responsible for administering the rules, et cetera, but they don't have copies of the law, and this basically eliminates, if I read this right, the responsibility of receiving at least one copy of the book, which is the green book that we've been referring to. Why was that deleted if in fact we want them to comply with the law?
So what we have started to do just in the past couple of years is we receive the full updated version of the New Hampshire statutes as a PDF document. And so we post that directly onto the department's website. And now you can go through and you have a list. So the 22, 23, or 21, 20, whatever the most recent version is there as a searchable PDF that's available to all districts free. What we don't have is the financial resources to provide a hard copy of that to every school and every district in the state. So we are making it freely available as an electronic resource to schools. We're not making it available as a hard copy resource.
There are those of us that are dinosaurs that like to have the
I
hard
make
copy
sure,
written in front of us. So,
yeah, I have 1 to 2 copies of all of them in my office, yeah.
yeah.
If,
Well, we've solved that for our committee, I believe, but.
Yes, right.
yes. And there are, if schools wanted hard copies, we can work with them to try to make that available. The tricky part for us is the funding piece, because we just don't have the funding resources to make that available to all districts.
You had, oh, go ahead.
No,
Representative Cornell.
Just in terms of usability, one thing I was searching and hunting for, in several places it refers back to a table. But you have to hunt to find that table throughout the whole document. For instance, table 306-1 is the required program areas and courses, and it refers to that several places, but to try and find then 306.1 is, I'm not sure how you can make that easier to locate, but it does require some searching.
Yeah.
And in some places it refers to, the table itself is called program areas and courses, but in other places it's referred to as subject areas.
That will need to be cleaned up. Yeah, thank you. That's good. And there was a pretty large effort in trying to clean up language like that, where the same thing was referred to in 2 or 3 or 4 different names. It's possible that's one area that we missed.
When you were reviewing this document, was there any discussion, pretty wide range of people on that group working? I noticed that when it comes to position and provision of staff and staff qualifications, we had like a ratio for every building, you have X number of principals or assistant principals, etc. Back in 2008-9, it was set up where the pupil-teacher ratio was 25-1 for K through 2 and 30-1 for grades 3 through 12. Was there any discussions I know that's not in here and not in the old either, but
So
other
that is
sections.
in this one.
That is in it.
It is, yes.
So where are you standing at? That same ratio?
No, so it's less. I believe it's 25-1 through either 5th grade or through 8th grade. And let me see where that particular section lives. So I want to give you accurate teacher-student ratios.
That is an area which I get hammered on more than anything else, is that I think it's very difficult to find a 30-1 anywhere in the state without having other adults in that room to assist.
Okay, so on page 20, at the bottom, ED 306-15 is class size. So kindergarten through grade 2 is 25 students or fewer, with the provision that districts will strive to achieve classes of 20 students or fewer. So the requirement is 25, but the expectation is 20. In grades 3 through 5, 30 with an expectation of 25. And then middle school and high school, 30 students or fewer. So it looks like it's the same.
That's not
But
a
it was
change, that
previously,
language
yeah.
comes right out of 2008 where Senator Estabrook was involved. So, well, it's still high. From an educator's perspective, that's, in today's changing world, that is a high PTR. I understand though, and that's, it's not in statute anywhere either, so it's gotta come through this rulemaking process, I would say.
This is the only place that
Yeah.
teacher-student ratios live, yeah,
Yeah.
within state regulations.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's also widely variable too. Like we've a lot of smaller districts throughout the state that have smaller classes. Where this probably predominantly affects districts is in our larger, more urban districts that have a much larger number of students.
But our adequacy formula still funds you based upon so much per pupil, and that is really a burden on the smaller districts. They oftentimes have ratios of 10-to-1, 14-to-1, and some much lower than that. So
When I taught physics, I never had a class larger than 6 students.
the PE class had 40 in it though, right?
Oh, I'm sure it did, yeah.
It balances out.
And there are provisions for class sizes, if you're talking about a band, chorus, some of our PE classes, where you can have much larger numbers of students. If you've got the Nashua high school band, is gonna have much more than 30 students in there practicing, but theoretically they'd also have the space to be able to do that. And, a large band room or a theater or stage.
That's where study halls come into effect too. They can have more people in a study hall than pick up that burden right there,
Right.
scheduling. Are there any other questions for this right now? Because we're closing in.
On page 77, where you're dealing with the sciences, you basically basically have a topical physical science, biology, chemistry. The issue again of the elimination of the concepts under each of those topics, what was the rationale for removing those?
So we had met with a group of science teachers, and we talked about this particular section here. Most of these topical areas are already covered within the academic standards, the state academic standards, and that's what teachers are using to build their curriculum. So the minimum standards really shouldn't be about diving into a granular level of curriculum. That's where the academic standards come in. So the minimum standards should be letting districts know you need to teach physical science, you need to teach biology, chemistry, physics. But if a teacher who's a biology teacher, they go to teach biology, they're not going to the minimum standards to determine what or how they're going to teach biology. They're going to go to the next generation science standards. And what we didn't want was to have a conflict between the much larger academic standards that teachers are using versus what might be prescribed within topical areas in the minimum standards.
Thanks for that clarification.
Rick?
Yes.
So, thanks. An area that we haven't talked about, I don't think, but you mentioned it early, right at the top when we were talking about the list of items in E2A.
Yeah.
E2A, something like that. And one of them, I think, was the school year.
Yes.
And days, hours, stuff like that. And there are some substantial edits, I think, between pages 21 and 22. And I was just wondering if you could sort of take us through those quickly. Yeah, so one of the things that jumps out at me, and it wasn't as a result of the changes, but that basically we require a minimum of 945 hours in elementary, and basically that doesn't translate to to a lot of days, or in 990 either, when you divide that instructional time by the maximum of 6 hours of instructional time. You're talking about like 160 days. And I think most people sort of have like 180 days on their mind when it comes to the school year, and just wondering why our minimum standards really are so minimal, when it comes to instructional time.
So instructional time refers to only the time that students are receiving instruction. So when a school looks at their day, they might have a school day that's 6 hours long, but they're subtracting out passing time in hallways, they're subtracting out lunchtime. So if a student has 45 minutes for lunch, that's coming out of that 6 hours. So right there's 45 minutes every day across the board, which increases the number of days. Same thing with passing time. Some schools might have school-wide study halls where no instruction is occurring. That time would be taken out of the instructional time. So to really have 6 full hours of instruction, you'd probably have to have a 7-hour school day,
Okay.
which most schools don't. Yeah, and that's where that comes in. So it does end up being much closer to that 180-day mark.
Okay, and then the changes where where it was explicit that lunch, homeroom, passing time, stuff like that, didn't count towards the 6 hours of instructional time, that was taken out.
Yes. That is because I receive a lot of phone calls where principals or teachers or parents will call and they want specific definitions of, well, what counts as instruction, what doesn't. Well, I don't think my school is offering enough instruction, or they're offering too much instruction. And when we have 3 or 4 things specifically called out here, that lunchtime, homeroom periods, passing time, and breaks are not counted, that suggests that, well, everything else is counted. And so what we tried to do instead was define what is instructional time in the definition section in the beginning.
Okay, right at the top.
Yep, in the definitions. And then say to districts, so you have a responsibility, using the definition of what instructional time is, to ensure that you're providing 6 hours of instruction, or whatever amount of instruction you provide per day to get to that 990. Because the number of phone calls and emails I get where someone says, well, but what if we have lunchtime where there's a speaker? Can we count that as instructional? And those are probably a lot of decisions that should be made at the local level as to how are you, with your local school board defining instructional time and building your calendar, and not calling me and trying to parse out the minimum standards of what is and is not allowed. So that's why we pulled that up, hopefully to reduce confusion.
Okay, so and a follow-up to that, and I'm sort of interested in what the department's thoughts are on this. In terms of maybe considering increasing the instructional time, in terms of number of hours across a year or something like that. Obviously, over the last several years, some things have been added to the list of what do we call them? The required academic areas of study.
Yeah.
And so, when you add things, they either, if the amount of time's not coming out, then time's gonna be taken away from math, ELL, stuff like that. Is there an opportunity to consider maybe allowing more instructional time, or requiring more instructional time?
And districts can have as much instructional time as they want. And in fact, whenever we get to the end of the school year, we oftentimes find districts who have offered over 1,000 hours of instruction in their year, because they'll get to the end and realize they had a few snow days. They've been counting by days and want to switch over to hours. So when they switch over to hours, they realize they've done 1,020 hours if they count in hours instead of days, just based off of how they structure their school day. And so it's so district by district specific, I think, in terms of the number of hours that are actually being offered. I'd love to do some kind of survey to find out what is the hours for all districts, because we have so many districts that just measure in days. We don't necessarily know the hours, and as long as you have 180 days,
Yeah.
you're still also meeting the state statute, and that's fine. The other thing is it's a requirement on schools. They have to offer 990 hours of instruction. There's no requirement on students that students get 990 hours of instruction, and that's been an interesting sort of dichotomy between those two things. And a good example of how to look at that is, if I take myself as an example, We were just talking about, I grew up in Ware, and there's a pancake house at the bottom of Pat's Peak that has great breakfast.
Intervale.
Yes, and in my junior and senior year of high school, I made sure I always had a study hall block 1 so that I could go to the pancake house instead of going to school and eat breakfast, and then go to school. I did not receive 990 hours of instruction because our school had an open campus policy where if you had a study hall and you were older than 16, you had a license, and your parents signed off on it, you could sign out. So the school was still offering 990 hours of instruction. I, as a student, probably got less than that because I took a study hall and used open campus privileges. So we see that at a high school level.
Sure.
Students who may have fulfilled almost all of their credit requirements by the end of junior year might only take 2 courses their senior year and graduate early. It's another example, that student's not receiving 990 hours of instruction, but they don't need to because they're still getting the requirements that they need to get in.
Met their graduation.
Yeah.
Right. I think it was you have a great idea to maybe get a survey on what districts are doing, and it'd be terrific if the Administrators Association might be able to help collect that data, because I think that would be something that's really good to know.
But isn't the school day contractual though with the teachers' unions of how many hours per day they put in? So that would by district determine how many hours the day lasts too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you'll see we did strike some language out here also around the number of hours and days required at the end of a year. We've run into some issues as well there, because depending on the number of days a school has done distance education versus snow days versus how much time they have to make up at the end of the year, we've run into situations where a district is required by the rule to make up a certain number of days that goes beyond the contractual days and hours of the teacher CBA in that district. And so you run into conflict there between what teachers can do under a CBA and what the state's requiring under the minimum standards. So we've tried to clean up that language a little, and that's why you'll see some things struck out here as well, because we're trying to eliminate that conflict between CBAs and time that's made up at the end of a year.
Thank you.
Further discussion today? Was there any effort to include within your rules anything about concurrent dual enrollment?
I believe there is language within 306.27 that says districts can offer that as opportunities for students, that students can engage in things like concurrent and dual enrollment courses. However, a district cannot use that as the only method for providing instruction in a particular area that they're responsible for. So for example, a district is required to teach Algebra 1. They can't say, well, if kids want to take Algebra 1, they can come over here and do it as like a dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment. So there is some stipulations around that. The district has to offer what they're required to offer initially, but then the rules allow districts to offer many more opportunities beyond that to students, including dual and concurrent enrollment.
So if it's a very small high school that cannot offer a course, can the virtual learning academy, the charter school, suffice for them having to offer it within the school?
It's a question that has come up. We know some districts have moved towards that. I think you could probably interpret it both ways. It was easier to interpret it pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic now, we do have a requirement that there are in-person options for students. Districts can make remote instruction available, but you have to have an in-person option. And that would seem to fly in the face of only offering opportunities through VLAX, because you wouldn't necessarily have an in-person option for students who may want that.
It's also a significant cost saving for a district that just doesn't have the money to do it.
And we do see that in courses that districts are not required to teach. So for example, if you're a very small high school and you've got 3 kids that want to take Latin, those 3 kids can take Latin through VLAX.
Yeah.
And that's completely fine because there's no requirement on the district that they teach Latin. But it would be harder if you said, well, we don't have an algebra teacher, so we're only going to offer algebra through VLAX. That kind of runs in the face of that requirement that you have an in-person option for the required courses of study at your school.
That's interesting.
So through competencies, an 8th grade student could potentially say, I've already mastered Algebra 1. But that small district may not offer trig or calculus, So you do it by way of VLAX as one of your, because you didn't take Algebra 1, you just took their assessment and say, I mastered everything there, or I met all the proficiency levels and all that. So then, but they don't offer another 3 available for that student. Could one take it VLAX? It seems they should be able to do that.
So there are minimum requirements of what a district has to offer in terms of the total number of math courses.
Well, they have to have
Maybe
43
6.
courses, correct?
Yeah, I think there's 6, you have to have at least 6 distinct courses in math. So specific enough in rules to deal with every situation.
Yeah.
And we've obviously seen many more districts, not even just in New Hampshire, but nationally, finding different ways of offering opportunities through remote instruction that students are able to take advantage of. I think it was one thing we certainly saw with the pandemic is an explosion in the availability of remote instruction opportunities for students.
Are there any other questions right now? We've jumped around quite a bit here, but what we want to do is we want, as a group, we will be, folks have just been handed this, so they haven't had a chance to really go through it and work, or do everything they want to do with it. So would you be willing to come back another time if necessary, if we have further questions?
Absolutely. The other thing I can offer too is I just completed a side-by-side of all the changes for the state board that we're sending to them to look at.
That'd
So I
be
can
wonderful.
also send that to you as well. And that goes paragraph by paragraph, what it is currently, what the changes are now, and then some of the rationale. So you've got 3 columns. And if I had finished that a week ago, I would have sent it to you, but it's been a large effort.
And when our side-by-side in 266, we'll first send it to Senator Ward here, seeing that's your bill, but we'll send a copy to you. That's a side-by-side with some other information that Jen's putting together for us.
Sounds good.
In your side-by-side, do you make reference, like when we were talking about where you've taken stuff out and put it into another section? Is that reference
Yes.
going to be in the side-by-side too?
That's a majority of what's in there. So it'll show, this paragraph was removed and put into
Great.
ED 306.14, for example. So it'll show exactly where things have been moved.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, Nate, really, thank you very much for coming today and helping us, responding to our questions and helping us move through the document.
Absolutely, that's what I'm
Certainly
here for.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, one other thing for Caitlin. Caitlin, on the mathematics, do you have any input from the local education agencies as far as what they're doing to try to improve upon mathematics? Are they adopting new curriculum? Are they assessing through diagnostic materials? 'Cause I am asked often, your math achievement scores are low. What are you doing, Mr. State? And my response is, that's a local decision. That doesn't cut it with half the people.
Wait, we just got multiplication tables.
Yeah, I know.
That's gonna solve all the
We'll see what the
problems.
Senate says, right?
Yeah.
We couldn't even get a consensus on that. And I couldn't get a consensus in the school I went to either. It was actually split in this school with the elementary and middle and high school teachers that taught math. They couldn't figure out, should we be required to memorize those times tables or not? But anyway, are you getting any information in from the districts, what they're doing?
We don't have a specific collection that we do from school districts relative to what they're doing in various different areas, so we don't have any data that we can provide on a consistent basis.
Is there any way we could solicit some information? What are you potentially doing as far as, are you adopting a totally new curriculum, or are you giving more time to it, hiring paraprofessionals, the whole gamut?
We could certainly talk about sending out a survey to school districts to give you the results of those. Maybe you and I want to work on some
Okay,
questions.
thank you, thank you. Further discussion from the committee, we're right at 12 o'clock. Thank you very much for coming today, everybody. We appreciate it, and this will continue.
Do we have a date for
Now,
it?
that's what I was gonna do.
Okay.
We need to establish a date for moving forward and exactly what we wanna do during that date. On September 26th, when we got ourselves organized, some of the issues which were put on a topic right here is tracking cohorts of students, and I think we're working with you on doing that with the I-platform, you know, going through in the mathematics areas. Alignment of current statewide assessment to curriculum instruction and sequence of skills and knowledge taught in schools. That's kind of a huge topic. You know, I've taken some time to look at other nationally norm reference tests like the what do you call it? The Iowa Test of Basic Skills, and there's another one which I been looking at, and of course the California Achievement Test and others to see regarding social studies, whether there's a way to assess social studies, which we don't do right now. Terra Nova is the name of it. That's other assessments used locally. We have some local assessments that are used locally for, you know, key math and some of those others. What do you call it? The one they use out in Washington. NIWA? NIWA? NIWA. Yeah. And let's see. Transition to post-secondary education. I am concerned that we have teacher preparation institutions, which the preparation, the number of teachers graduating from them is declining, and due to a whole lot of factors, not necessarily a result of the state here, but are we teaching these academic standards in the methods courses at the post-secondary level? So folks are coming out, if they're taking a methods course in mathematics, what kind of standards are they using at UNH, PSU, and Keene? Are we sharing our standards with post-secondary education? And the status of academic standards, you know, that's something we want to look at. Social studies was one of those areas, kind of waiting for that civics bill to get to us, but that's only one small fraction of social studies. And we'd like to see something moved on that. Teacher training, we looked at that. Well, there's a number of things on the list. Just if anybody here wants to pursue something, let me know so we can try to get folks to come in and help us out. We were going to do that with social studies groups in the state. We were looking at that old academic standards, 2008 I think it is, or 6. So we will convene again. What's a good time for everybody? What time did,
Didn't we decide on April 17th?
Yeah, 17th at 9
at
for the EFA.
at 9 o'clock, is that an hour and a half, Senator?
Yes.
We could meet on that same day that we're also meeting for that at let's say 10 to 12?
10:30. I think you,
Oh, you're going from
Well, we're
9?
gonna do 9 to 10:30.
Oh, you're going 9 to 10:30?
An hour and a half, yes, because I think we're gonna need it.
Okay.
We can bring lunch and.
We could go from immediately following 10:30 onwards to noontime
Yep.
and have a follow-up. By then, we might have a side-by-side, and we'd also have had an opportunity to deal with 2662. So let's put it down on the date, 13th at 10:30.
17.
17th. I'll get it ready. We're losing the sun outside. Okay, nothing else. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you very